In Jewish History series. We're very excited to kick off this new series here on TorahAnytime.com. If you were following the Jewish Destiny series, you know that the Jewish Destiny series was a survey of all of Jewish history, starting with the creation of the world, coming up until modern times, 75 sessions going through the entirety of Jewish history. But Jewish history, more than the study of events that took place, is really the study of people. And therefore, through the Profiles in Jewish History series, we'll be delving into some of the key personalities throughout Jewish history who have made us who we are as a people. And our first unit, our first session in the Profiles in Jewish History series will be the men of the Talmud, where we will be looking into some of the great men who made the Talmud what it is. Because we as the Jewish people are often referred to as the people of the book. And I believe that when many use this accolade, they think of the Tanakh, the 24 books of the Bible. But I believe that we are in fact the people of the book, but it's really the Talmud, because the Talmud makes us who we are as a nation. And the Talmud is fascinating because, first of all, it was a creation of human beings. The Tanakh was a creation of the Almighty, transmitted down the 5 books of Moses to Moshe, the books of the prophets and the writings to the prophets. But the Talmud is a purely human creation. It was recording all of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, all of the customs, all of the laws, all of the debates on how we understand how the laws come out from the Tanakh, the biblical exegesis, how we understand the different positions. It is a human creation, and therefore we'll be delving into the life of a lot of those humans. Now, this is not such an easy thing to piece together. First of all, from the Talmud itself, the Talmud is in no ways a history book, similar to how the Tanakh is not a history book. But when the Talmud gives us a story, what we call an Agadata, it's not giving us just a history lesson, it's giving us a timeless lesson. So as we piece these things together and we talk about these great men of the Talmud, we will be able to bring out those timeless lessons that the Gemara, that the Talmud has given to us. And in truth, when we look at the Talmud, that is really the secret to our longevity as a nation. Any ancient nation can look at us and baffle us, how are we still here? Because we as the Jewish people, we're not a religion, we're not an ethnic class, we're a nation, we are Am Yisrael, and we are the only nation in the history of the world that has survived in exile. I often tell the story that the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of the Tibetan people in exile, once convened a group of Jewish leaders together because he wanted to figure out what the secret of the longevity of the Jewish people was. Now, he did this, I believe, in the 1980s or 1990s when the Tibetan people had been in exile for all of about 30 years. And we have been in exile now for 2,000 years, and we have preserved ourselves as a people. What's the secret to our longevity? Well, I believe a lot of it is the Talmud, is the fact that we have the Talmud and the Limud Torah, the study that the Talmud have spawned off in the yeshivas throughout, not only the yeshivas we have today, but the yeshivas throughout Jewish history. So, through this first part of the Profiles in Jewish History series, we're going to delve into some of these great men and try and understand who they were and the impact that they had, not only on the Jewish people and their time, but on all of Jewish history. We start tonight with Rav Yochanan ben Zakai. Now, Rav Yochanan ben Zakai is an individual who really lived in a terrible time for the Jewish people. Now, truth be told, when you look at Jewish history, except with modern times, it's almost impossible to find a time that wasn't terrible. You know, we can say about almost any snapshot in Jewish history, and we said this many times in the Jewish Destiny series, that if we as a people survive this, we can survive anything. Well, one of those such time periods was the end of the Second Commonwealth, the time before the destruction of the Jewish people. And that's the time period that Rav Yochanan ben Zakai lived. He lived roughly from the year 30 before the Common Era to roughly the year 80 or 90 of the Common Era. He lived almost 120 years, and during that long life that he lived, he saw the rise of Christianity, which was ripping the Jewish people apart from the inside. He was himself, according to most opinions, he was a Kohen. And he lived at a time, and he actually worked in the temple in a time when the high priesthood was completely corrupt, was basically given to the highest bidder. And, he as a priest had to function in that situation. He was still living at the time when the debate between who would be supreme, the Academy of Shammai or the Academy of Hillel. And he was a student of both of them. He saw the destruction of the temple. and he sees really the prelude to the destruction of the temple, which is spawned on by groups known as the Biryonim, the Kanaim, the young people who were all excited about war, who thought they could take on the great Roman Empire, and he tried to convey the message to them that we have to listen to the elders, that listening to you young, energetic people has never been good for Jewish history. And he gives them the example of Rechavam ben Shlomo, of the son of King Solomon, Rechavam, who, when he took over for his father, King Solomon, he consulted both his peers, his young advisors, as to what he should do, and he consulted his father's advisors as to what he should do and to how he should deal with the Jewish people. And the young advisors said, basically, show him who's boss, right? You're the king now. It's good to be the king. Show him who's boss. His father's advisors said, go easy on them. It's been rough for the Jewish people these past number of years. They were taxed heavily. They worked hard to get the temple built. You should go easy on them. And Rechavam made the ill-fated decision to listen to his peers, and he said to the Jewish people that my father whipped you with whips of leather, I'm going to whip you with scorpions. And therefore they responded, okay, so we're taking our marbles and we're going home. And 10 out of 12 of the tribes broke away from him, leading to the schism of the northern and the southern kingdoms in the first temple time period. So Rav Yochanan ben Zakai tries to influence the young people of his nation as to don't listen to the young hotheads who want to fight, who think they can fight the Romans. Listen to the sages. Listen to the rabbis, the old rabbis like me. At the time of the destruction of the temple, he was over 100 years old. Listen to the old rabbis. We know what we're talking about. But we're going to see he just couldn't quite have the full influence that he wanted to. Now, when we look at the lineage of Rav Yochanan ben Zakai, we don't know a lot, but for what we're told, as we mentioned before, according to most opinions, he was most likely a Kohen, and he was also, presumably on his mother's side, a descendant of the great King Chizkiyahu, the righteous King Hezekiah, and that's what we know about his lineage. And with someone who lived the spawn of such a long life, 12 decades, 120 years, he influenced generations of students and was really one of the key individuals that saw that the Jewish people would survive beyond the destruction of the temple. So when he's born in roughly the year 30 before the Common Era, that right away is really the beginning of the downward spiral that led to the destruction of the temple 100 years later. And that's because in his early years he saw the Herodian regime. He saw King Herod, his descendants, take over the reign of the Jewish people, take it over from the Hasmoneans, and he saw the Hasmonean dynasty completely wiped out by King Herod, and he saw Roman rule really take over in Israel. That was through his youth, the first few decades of his life. And beyond that, another hallmark trademark of the Herodian rulers, especially King Herod himself, was that anyone who he felt threatened him, he killed. And along these lines, he killed many of the Talmidei Chachamim. He killed many of the scholars of his time. There were only a few exceptions, and the two exceptions were actually Hillel and Shammai. One of the reasons that we'll see that Hillel and Shammai had such an influence on the Jewish people was that they were two of myriads of scholars. They were able to come to some sort of accommodation with Herod, and therefore they were able to have their own academies unscathed, while many other scholars came in the crosshairs of Herod and were killed out by Herod. So this is when Rav Yochanan ben Zakai is in his formative years. This is what he's seeing going on in the land of Israel, and he actually studies in both the academies of Hillel and Shammai. We don't know of a lot of crossovers besides Rav Yochanan ben Zakai, but he is one that we are told about. We're actually told by the Talmud that the great Hillel himself had 80 disciples, had 80 great disciples, and Yonasan ben Uziel was the greatest of them, and Yochanan ben Zakai, our subject for tonight, was the smallest of them. Now, what does it mean that he was the smallest of them? Does that mean that, in the class ranking the class, and there's Yonasan ben Uziel was number 1, there were 78 people between them, and Yochanan ben Zakai was the bottom of the class? I don't think that's what it means. It seems from many different sources that it meant that he was the youngest at the end of Hillel's life. Meaning, when we look at the time period when Hillel had an influence on the Jewish people, Hillel also lived a very long life, and Yonasan ben Uziel was at the beginning of his teaching, was one of the older of the students, and at the end of Hillel's life, you had Yochanan ben Zakai, who was one of the youngest of his students. And I believe that's what it means that he was the lesser of the students. I don't think this means that the 79 in front of them on the list were greater than Yochanan ben Zakai. Yochanan ben Zakai was the youngest, and we're going to see because he was the youngest at the time of Hillel, he was probably in his 20s when he studied by Hillel, that he would take the influence of Hillel into 100 years, into another century that he would live. And we're going to see that Hillel, really, a lot of the philosophies of Hillel were inculcated in Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai, and it was those philosophies that led Yochanan ben Zakai to be able to prepare the Jewish people for the destruction that was imminent, and be able to prepare us that we would be that faithful group of that faithful nation on the map of world history that would actually survive in exile, that would actually survive destruction, unlike every other single nation on the map of world history. So this is what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai does, so to speak, as the smallest of the students of Hillel. Now, we see that Hillel sees the greatness that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai is destined for, because as Hillel lies on his deathbed, and all of these great students of Hillel come to console and have their parting words with their Rebbe, with Hillel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai is the youngest, is too modest to come in. He stays outside. These are the great men of Israel, and he's only 20-something years old. And he stays outside. And Hillel says, where's the little one? Where's the young one? And they say, he's sitting outside. Hillel says, bring him in here. You have to bring him in here because he is the father of all wisdom and the father of all generations. In other words, yes, he's young today, but he's going to be the one to make it all work. He's going to be the one to ensure the continuity of the Jewish people. Now, we're taught that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai, his life is divided into 3 sections. He spent the first 40 years of his life involved in business and commerce. The second 40 years of his life were spent engrossed in study and studying with the great men of Israel. And then the final 40 years of his life was when he was the leader of the Jewish people. Now, it's unclear from the Talmud exactly what positions Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai had. We know that he was never the Nasi per se, the prince of Israel, because the prince had to be a descendant of the house of King David, and it seems that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai was not. Even though on his mother's side, we mentioned before, he was, through Chizkiyahu, but we also are told he's a Kohen, which meant on his father's side, he is not in the Davidic line, he is from the house of Aaron, from the house of priests. So therefore, he can never become the Nasi, but we're going to see he is definitely at some point the interim Nasi, we'll call him, and he also for sure is the Av Beis Din, which was the number 2 position in Israel for a period of time. So it seems that in pre-destruction Israel, he's the number 2. He is the Av Beis Din. And in Israel, once he begins that time period of being a great scholar, being a great teacher, he establishes a great yeshiva in Jerusalem where the greatest of minds of Israel come to study. And when things actually start heating up in Jerusalem, so to speak, with the Roman influence, and Yochanan ben Zakai doesn't like what he's seeing, he moves out of Jerusalem. He goes to Galilee, and he opens an institution, the Galilee, where he is for 18 years. But at the end, he moves back to Jerusalem. Number one, because he feels that just the Galilee and the mountains, the nice area, people are dull, right? They're not sharp in their learning. They're not focused on spiritual growth. But also, he saw that the Jewish people in Jerusalem needed him, and that he could have an influence on what was going on in Jerusalem. Now, our sages tell us that in pre-destruction Jerusalem, there are Chaf Daled Kitim B'Yerushalayim. There are 24 dissenting groups within the Jewish people, within Jerusalem. We're taught that the temple was destroyed because of Sinas China, because of baseless hatred, one Jew to another. And we see a lot of that manifested in the internal fighting, literally the civil war that goes on between these 24 groups. Yes, it's the Romans who eventually will destroy the second temple, but it's really the internal fighting, the civil war of all these groups that brings on the destruction of the Jewish people. Now, one of the most radical of these groups is a group called the Biryonim. The Biryonim is a group of young zealots that we mentioned before think that they can take on the Romans, and they think that they can Jerusalem can once again, that Israel can once again have complete sovereignty outside of the Romans, and they really are the ones who provoke the war. That they provoke the war, they provoke the Romans, they poke the bear in the eye, and the Romans eventually lay siege to Jerusalem, and the Biryonim want the Jews to fight. So the Talmud tells us, what do they do to provoke the Jewish people to fight? They say, well, there's storehouses here in Jerusalem that could sustain the Jewish people for 20 years. And as long as the Jewish people are comfortable with their storehouses, they have enough food to sustain a siege of 20 years, then they're never going to fight. So what do the Biryonim do? They burn down the storehouses in Jerusalem, basically making it that, their thought was that the Jewish people will have to fight now that there's no storehouses, but they also bring about mass famine within this siege. So they literally kill, the civil war brings to a situation where it's Jew killing Jew. And that's what's going on in Jerusalem when Yochanan ben Zakai is the Av Bezdin, is the number 2 leader in the Jewish people. Now, an interesting poetic twist of history, one of the leaders of the Biryonim is a man named Abba Sikra, and he is actually the nephew of Rav Yochanan ben Zakai. That's a problem when we have a Jewish civil war or a Jewish fight. It's a family fight. It's always going to be a family fight. You're only going to be so far removed from the person who you're fighting against. And sure enough, it was Rav Yochanan ben Zakai's nephew, Abba Sikra, who was the leader of this terrible group, the Biryonim. So one day, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai is able to get an audience with his wayward nephew, and he berates him. He says, what are you doing? He says, number one, you can't beat the Romans. There's no way we're going to beat the Romans. And number two, your actions are leading to the death and famine of tens of thousands of Jewish people. Your mother raised you better than this, Abba Sikra. What are you doing? My sister, your mother raised you better than this. What are you doing? To which Abba Sikra responded, he said, Fetter, my dear uncle, you're right. You're 100% right. But the problem is when you have a fanatical, radical group like the Sikrikin, like the Biryonim, they don't listen to me. I might be their leader, but they wouldn't listen to me. The cat is out of the bag. It's a train moving downhill 1,000 miles an hour. I can't do anything to stop them. They'll just kill me. And that's what we see so often throughout history when you have these fanatical groups, these radical groups. We talked about when we kill Osama bin Laden, Yamach Shemo. Well, there's 1,000 more behind him, and if we can get rid of the Ayatollah in Iran, well, there's 1,000 more behind him, and you just get rid of these terrible people. But unfortunately, there's just such a culture of hatred. There's always 1,000 more behind him, ready to stand up and do the same exact thing. And that's what Abba Sikra says back to his uncle. He says, I agree with you. This is out of control, but I can't do anything to stop it. So together with his nephew, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai contrives a plan to try and at least bring about some salvation for the Jewish people. Now, part of this situation within the walls of Jerusalem to get the Jewish people to fight, part of the situation was that nobody could leave, nobody could enter. It was a siege on both sides, right? The Romans, so to speak, wouldn't let you out, or wouldn't let you in, and the Biryonim wouldn't let you out. But there's an old custom that we don't bury, there's no cemeteries within Jerusalem. And I'm talking about ancient Jerusalem, what we call now the old city of Jerusalem. There's no cemeteries within Jerusalem, and therefore the dead are always brought outside of the city and buried. That's why you have the Mountain of Olives right outside of the city of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, because that was the ancient graveyard for those in Jerusalem. So even though there was the siege from without and from within, there was a deal was made that the dead had, from the famine and from the war, had to be brought outside of the city, and the Romans would let them go to their burial. So the Biryonim guarded the city and would only let out the dead from the inside. Now, Abba Sikra and Yochanan ben Zakai come up with this plan that a message will go out that Yochanan ben Zakai is on his deathbed, and they will basically fake his death, and then they will put him into a coffin. Two of his students who are in on the plan will carry him outside of the city, and he'll make his way to the Roman lines to talk to the Roman general Vespasian. Now, the Biryonim don't make it so easy. They think they sort of are worried. They suspect the hoax of the great rabbi, so they want to stab the coffin to make sure he's really dead. To which the students carrying the coffin say, "No, you can't. You can't do that. The Romans will say, here the Jews just stab the great rabbi after he dies. That would look terrible." And say, "Okay, well, let us give it a good shake and see what happens." They say, "No, you can't do that, because the Jews will say this is how the Biryonim treat our great rabbi." So finally they convince him to let him go through enemy lines. They take the casket out, and they take the coffin out. And sure enough, once they get far enough away from the city, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai comes out of the coffin, and he makes his way to Roman lines. And he asks to meet with the great Vespasian, the great Roman general who's leading the siege of Jerusalem. And he finally is brought to Vespasian, and he says, "Greetings to you, Emperor of Rome." And to which Vespasian responds, "You know you are guilty of treason and therefore guilty of death for two reasons. Number one, I'm not the Caesar. I'm not the Emperor of Rome. And number two, if I am the Emperor of Rome, what took you so long to come?" And they go into a back and forth. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai says the Biryonim wouldn't let me out. And he said you should have jumped the walls. And they go back and forth on this for a little while. In the midst of their discussion, a messenger comes and says that the Caesar in Rome has died, and the Roman Senate has voted, sure enough, that Vespasian should be the Emperor of Rome. Well, Vespasian is so elated that he's going to be able to go back to Rome as the Caesar, as the emperor, and it was really Yochanan ben Zakai who brought him these good tidings. So he says, because you brought me these good tidings, I'm going to grant you three wishes. What does Rabbi Yochanan ask for? He says, "Ten li Yavna v'chachmea." Give me the city of Yavna, that's a city on the western part of Israel, near Tel Aviv, and give me Yavna and the scholars. Okay? He says, preserve the family of Rabban Gamliel, because the Roman policy was to always kill the leadership, no matter what, of any dissenting group or any conquered group. So no matter what you do with Jerusalem, no matter what you do with Israel, with Judah, let's preserve the family of Rabban Gamliel. Okay? Because that was the family of the Nasi, the family of leadership of the Jewish people, and really the house of David. And the third one was that he asked for a doctor for Reb Tzadok. Reb Tzadok was one of the great sages who had been fasting for 40 years in anticipation of the impending doom of Jerusalem. And because of this, he was very old and frail, and Yochanan ben Zakai wanted a doctor for Reb Tzadok. Now, in these three things, Vespasian's like, I told you I'd give you anything, and you're asking me for nothing? Fine, take it. Take Yavna and its scholars. We'll let the family of Rabban Gamliel go unscathed, and he'll give you a doctor for the old rabbi. So even though Vespasian thought he was giving Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai nothing, he really, in truth, gave him everything. Because Yavna and its scholars were going to preserve Jewish scholarship. The family of Rabban Gamliel were going to preserve Jewish leadership, and a doctor for Reb Tzadok were going to preserve the righteous elders of the Jewish people. And it was through these things, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai understood, through these key elements, if we always have these three elements, the Jewish people can survive anything. If we have Torah scholarship, if we have proper leadership, and we have our righteous elders to look up to, we can survive any exile. So here Vespasian thought he was giving him nothing, and in truth, he gave him everything. And there's a famous story that I love to tell about how the great Panovich Rav once came to Rome on a fundraising mission. And he insisted before going to his hotel, even though it was a dark and stormy night as the story is told, he insisted on going to the Arch of Titus. The Arch of Titus was the arch that Titus, who's Vespasian's son, who takes over the siege. It's the arch is built in memory and commemoration of the Roman destruction of Israel. And the Panovich Rav stands by that arch on this rainy night, and he says, Titus, ich bin dur. He says, Titus, I am here, but where are you? Titus is gone. No one talks about Titus anymore unless you're a historian and reading history books. But we as the Jewish people are still here because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai knew what to ask for. Now, he's later criticized by Rabbi Akiva that he should have asked for the temple. He should have asked him to leave Jerusalem. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai basically responds that we needed just a little bit of salvation. In other words, we needed these three things to survive, and in so doing implies that Vespasian wouldn't have given up the siege, so I didn't want to get nothing. We needed to get out of him enough for us to survive, and that's what we got. And because of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai and those three things, we are still here today. So he goes on with his students, he goes to Yavna, they built an academy, and they wait to hear the terrible tidings. And eventually they hear about it, and they tear kriya, and they cry, and then Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai says, okay, but we still have to move on. And that was, after the destruction, the inspiration he gives the Jewish people, that we can be a nation without a temple. We can be a nation in exile. We can be a nation without a homeland, and we can still survive, and dare I say, thrive as a nation. And it was that inspiration in the waning decades of his life that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai gives to the Jewish people. The Talmud tells us a number of the character traits about the greatness of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai. The Talmud tells us he never engaged in frivolous talk. that he never walked 4 cubits, 4 amos, roughly 6 to 8 feet, without Torah thought and without wearing tefillin, except on Shabbos and Yom Tov. No one ever came before him in the study hall. He was always the first one in the yeshiva to show up, and no one left after him at night. He was the last one to leave. He never slept in the study hall, even a short nap. He was never found to be idle in any way. He was always reviewing his Torah. He always opened the door to greet his students. He never let anyone do anything for him. He never act on with any pretension that he was better than anyone. Even his students, he always greeted them. And he never said over a teaching if he couldn't say how he heard it from his teachers. And no one ever greeted him first, not a Jew, not a non-Jew. He always greeted everyone first. And in Yavna, as he was working to preserve the Jewish people, he made many enactments that we still follow until today. The taking of the lulav and esrog for 7 days on Sukkot, that was an enactment of Yavna. Originally, that was only done in the temple. But we take the lulav for 7 days, not just 1 day as the Torah prescribes, because Yochanan ben Zakai said in Yavna, we're going to do this to remember the temple. The idea that when the Kohanim dochen, when they say the priestly blessing, they take off their shoes, even though they're not in the temple. In the temple, the Kohanim didn't wear shoes. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai says, even though the priestly blessing is done outside the temple, they're going to take off their shoes to remember the temple. And beyond many of these great enactments to remember the temple, to save the Jewish people, he fought heresy wherever he had the opportunity. With the groups like the Sadducees and non-Jewish groups who philosophically threatened the Jewish people, he took them head on and debated the point of the supremacy of Torah. Because his goal was to preserve the Jewish people through thick and through thin. And one day, and part of this, giving chizuk to the Jewish people, he was passing the temple in Jerusalem, the destructions of the temple. And his students said, woe unto us. We used to have a temple to atone for our sins, and what do we have now? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai responds, you know what we have now? We have chesed, acts of loving kindness. Because the prophet Hosea says in the name of the Almighty, that the Almighty desires kindness, not offerings. And that was how he looked at the world. He said, yes, the ideal state of the Jewish people is with a temple, but we will survive without a temple. And when he passed away around the year 80 or 90 of the Common Era, the Gemara in Brachos, Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis, tells us the story of his passing, where he's literally frightened. And his students say to him, why are you frightened? And he says, you know, if I was going in front of a king of flesh and blood, I'd be okay, because I know how to talk to a human. I could bribe him. I could debate my case. And worst comes to worst, he'd throw me in jail. But it'll just be jail in this world. It wouldn't be a permanent situation. So, I know how to deal with humans. I've been on this planet for 120 years. But I don't know how to deal with the Almighty. I'm going before the Almighty. I shouldn't be in fear. What's going to happen? And in so doing, he gave the message to his students that halavai, we as humans, should fear the Almighty at least as much as we fear a human king. We all, again, we don't live in monarchies anymore, but we can all think of some human we fear. We can all think of some human, we all can. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai said, halavai, we should only have at least that much fear for the Almighty. Because we as Jews have an obligation, like our fathers, like our parents. We have to honor them and we have to fear them. We have to love them, we have to fear them. And so to the Almighty. And so often, I know nowadays, it's very important to talk about how much the Almighty loves us. And He does. But just like there's human beings we fear, we should have the same fear for the Almighty. And this was the final lesson that He gave to His students before He took leave of this world. So it was really Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai was one of the key individuals, not only one of the great men of the Talmud, but one of the great men in such a terrible time for the Jewish people that was focused on one thing and one thing only: doing whatever he could, doing whatever was possible to save the Jewish people, to preserve the Jewish people, and to make it that we would be a nation and a people that would thrive for years, decades, and dare I say centuries after his life. And because of all those efforts, Rav Yochanan ben Zakai lives on, and we as a nation live on. That's Rav Yochanan ben Zakai. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Next week, God willing, we will delve into the life and times of Rabban.